Welcome to the Biostasis Technologies podcast. Our guest this month is Ralph Merkle, who I've known for, oh my goodness, something over 30 years, I'm not sure.
Quite a while.
Quite a while, yes. I've known Ralph in the context of both cryonics and nanotechnology and cryptography. As some of you may know, cryptocurrencies are partly based on the Merkle tree, which is named, not surprisingly, after Ralph Merkle. Ralph's also made some very interesting comparisons between cryptography and cryonics and the use of cryptographic techniques to potentially infer structure of the brain in the future. We might talk a bit about that, but primarily I want to focus on a recent paper that Ralph wrote along with quite a few authors on advances in nanotechnology. So let's get into that paper, Ralph. The paper is on inverted mode scanning tunneling microscopy. It's a little bit of a mouthful. And how it, can you explain what that is and why it constitutes an important breakthrough for the technical feasibility of molecular nanotechnology?
Well, the first thing I should probably do is explain scanning tunneling microscopes for those members of the audience who haven't heard about them. And the scanning tunneling microscope at its heart is a sharp pointy stick. I can illustrate here. You have a sample surface there, and a sharp pointy stick. And the sharp pointy stick moves over the sample surface. And if there is a voltage between the sharp pointy stick and the sample surface, then when the sharp pointy stick touches the surface, you get a flow of current. And when it pulls back, the flow of current stops. So that's the idea of a scanning tunneling microscope. You move a sharp pointy stick over the surface, and if you have a good sharp pointy stick, then the atom, singular, at the end of the sharp pointy stick can be used to image the surface. And that's what a scanning tunneling microscope is. Now, what we've done is we had a question in mind, and the question was, if you want to build something using molecular tools, how do you do that? Well, to build something with molecular tools, you have to bring up a first tool that makes a first change to the build surface. Then you have to bring up a second tool, a different tool, and then a third tool, and a fourth tool, and a fifth tool. And you keep having to move forward in that fashion from one tool to another. So how do you do that with the scanning tunneling microscope? Well, we have a surface, and what we can do is scatter molecular tools on the surface. Now, a molecular tool has two ends. It has a butt end, which sticks to the surface, and it has a sharp pointy end, which points up. That's the business end of the molecular tool. And if you want to add a little bit of material to the surface, if you want to add one or two carbon atoms, or you want to modify the surface, or you want to remove a hydrogen atom from the surface, if you want to change the surface in some way, then the business end of the sharp pointy tool is what you want to use to do it. Now, if you have a lot of sharp pointy tools with their butt ends stuck to the surface, and you have a probe, you can now move the probe from one to another. Well, if you have a sharp pointy probe, that's not much of a build surface. So what you do is you take the sharp pointy probe and you shave off the end of the sharp pointy probe so there's a little flat surface. And that little flat surface is now your build site. And now what you can do is you can move the probe from one molecule to another on the surface. And if the flat spot is small, perhaps a few tens of nanometers, and the molecules scattered on the surface are typically farther apart than the size of the flat spot on the end of the probe, then when you bring the flat spot up to one molecule, one molecular tool, only one molecular tool is interacting with the surface at a time. So that lets you bring up one tool to the little flat spot on the end of the probe and modify the build site. And then you can move the probe to another site, another molecule on the surface, and make another change. And then you can move the probe to another site. So you just keep this up, and that lets you apply different molecular tools to different spots on the build site, or the same spot over and over again, and do something to the build site that is constructive. So not only can you do that, you can also use one of the sharp pointy tools to scan the little flat spot on the end of the probe. So now, instead of the probe being sharp and pointy and scanning the surface, which is what happens in normal STMs, you have a molecular tool on the surface scanning the flat spot on the end of the probe. Hence, inverted mode. The surface, the molecules on the surface, are scanning and modifying the build site, the flat spot on the end of the probe. So that's the basic idea. And once you have this experimental setup arranged, and believe me, it took a lot of work to set this up, then you can use your molecular tools scattered on the surface to build something on the build site, which is the small flat spot on the end of the probe. So that's basically it.
And for people watching this, I think most people have some understanding of nanotechnology, but for those who perhaps don't, why is this apparently very technical discovery exciting? What is it useful for?
Well, before we did this, it was very difficult to bring up, say, a sequence of 100 different molecular tools to a single build site and do a series of sequential operations on the build site. Now it's easy. Once you have this inverted mode setup working, you simply move the probe from one molecule on the surface to the next molecule on the surface. And you can use the molecules to image the flat spot. So you can image the flat spot on the surface and see what is there on the flat spot. And then you can also remove hydrogens if you happen to have a hydrogen you want removed on the flat spot. And you can also deposit carbon atoms. And we have been depositing experimentally 2 carbon atoms. That's in the paper. And this allows you to now build things on the surface. And the nice thing about this is that you should be able to build stuff into 3 dimensions, which we are still working on. And that will let you build small molecular atomically precise objects. So that's basically it.
And the reason we want to do this from a cryonics perspective?
Okay, so this is step 1. What you want to do from the point of view of cryonics is build a nanofactory. To build a nanofactory, which can use lots and lots of molecular tools to build lots and lots of atomically precise structures, to build a nanofactory, you need to build your first atomically precise structures. How do I put this? First, you demonstrate mechanosynthesis. Once you have demonstrated it, then you have to master mechanosynthesis so you can build small atomically precise blocks. Once you can build the small atomically precise blocks, then you assemble them into what's called a fabricator. And a fabricator, it is essentially a device which is a very small scanning probe microscope sitting on the surface. And your fabricator, because it's very small, can now build things on the surface, and it can build them very rapidly because It's small and moves quickly. So you can now build things more rapidly using the fabricator, and that lets you build more complex structures, and then that lets you build, in turn, the blocks that make up the nanofactory, and then you assemble. I think I misspoke. You don't build a nanofactory. What you build is a single replicating unit. And once you have a single replicating unit, then that single replicating unit, which is relatively small, can then replicate and populate the nanofactory. And the nanofactory consists of a large number of replicating units, which together constitute the nanofactory. Was that coherent, or did I lose people on that one?
I don't know. I'd have to ask people, but I thought it was coherent. I think.
Well, if you think it's coherent, I'll believe it. So
Okay.
let's move forward.
Well, I think one thing maybe to expand on, because it may be the impression that there's a single device here. You talked about building a number of them, but obviously to build, to better do useful work like repairing tissues and that kind of thing, and building machines that can go into tissues and repair them, it would seem like you need to better have a nanofactory that can do a lot of stuff, a lot of different areas to work. So where do we go from here to reach something like that? Do you have to build these things in parallel? Can you explain how that would?
Okay, so once you have built the nanofactory, then you use the nanofactory to build medical nanorobots. And medical nanorobots are familiar. Freitas has done a lot of work on that and has published a lot of papers describing various medical nanorobots. My favorite is the Respirocyte because it's conceptually simple and it looks like it's very helpful. So the Respirocyte is on the order of 1 or 2 microns in diameter, and it is basically a very small tank of compressed oxygen. So the Respirocyte releases the compressed oxygen in your. I'm moving ahead too quickly. The Respirocyte is a medical nanorobot which you inject into your circulatory system. So once you can manufacture enough medical nanorobots and enough Respirocytes, you can then inject them into your circulatory system. Now, if you have a sufficient dose of Respirocytes circulating in your blood, then they can release oxygen in your tissues and absorb carbon dioxide in the tissues. And then when they reach the lungs, they can release the carbon dioxide and absorb the oxygen. So this allows them to circulate and essentially do exactly the same job as red blood cells. The difference is they can hold something like 100 times the capacity of the oxygen that your red blood cells can hold. And what this means in practice is that you can continue to provide oxygen even if your oxygen flow is temporarily cut off. For example, suppose you were prone to a heart attack. If you were prone to a heart attack and you had been injected with a suitable dose of these Respirocytes, and you found yourself with a non-functioning heart, with the medical nanorobots, the response is, oh my heart has stopped. But you would not stop respiring. Your tissues would still be oxygenated with the oxygen from the Respirocytes. This is in stark contrast to what would happen if you did not have the Respirocytes. If you have no Respirocytes and you have a heart attack, you go, oh my, I'm having a heart attack. And then you probably collapse on the spot because there is no oxygen going to your tissues.
So this could buy you perhaps an hour or two for someone to get you to a hospital and fix the problem.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it switches a heart attack from an instantaneous problem that has to be dealt with in a matter of seconds to a problem that has to be dealt with in a matter of an hour or two. And in an hour or two, once your heart stops, how do I phrase it? If my heart stopped, I would very much like to get to a local medical facility. So.
And there are probably many other uses. I can just see, we just had the enhanced games. I can just see in the future there might be, underwater free swimming underwater, a mile race underwater without having to breathe. I'm sure it'd be one kind of
It
awesome.
would be helpful if you were doing scuba diving.
Yeah.
Just have a lot of these things and swim around freestyle.
Mm.
But that's one of the basic medical nanorobots. There are a variety of others that have been discussed and analyzed. But the immediate problem, I don't know, the immediate problem for a while is that we do not have the manufacturing capability to make them. Once you have a nanofactory, you can build medical nanorobots. But you need a nanofactory. To build a nanofactory, you need a large number of replicating units. To get a large number of replicating units, you start with one replicating unit. To get one replicating unit, you have to build it. To build it, you use a fabricator to build one replicating unit. To build a fabricator, you use inverted mode scanning tunneling microscopy and a few other tricks.
So stack of technologies, basically.
It's a stack that we've,
yeah.
And I think, what's impressed me is we've got an amazingly good team that is very good at working on mechanosynthesis. So that's the first step. And that, I think, is shifting people's attitudes. There's an old saying that a new idea it goes through 3 phases. The first phase is it's impossible. And a few years ago, we were going through that phase and everyone said it's impossible. The second phase is it's possible, but it's not economical. And we're in the middle of that phase now because it's pretty obvious that mechanosynthesis is possible. So it's very hard to argue at this point that it is not. And then the third phase is it's obvious and I knew it all along.
Yeah, right.
So,
and one of the cool kids, I knew it all along. Yeah, right.
Exactly. And everyone says they knew it all along because that's what you say.
Yeah.
Well, certainly the public key stuff went through that progression. Initially, I would try to explain the concept and people would say, that doesn't make any sense. That's impossible. How can you agree on a cryptographic key over an open communications channel? That's obviously absurd.
Yeah.
And, that lasted for a while and then it went away. And then it was, well, but is it economical? And yeah, now it's in widespread use and it's economical and everyone says it's obvious. So,
right. Well, that reminds me of the old debate between Eric Drexler and Richard Smalley, with Smalley arguing that this stuff can't possibly work because of fat fingers, blah blah blah. So, do you think this will really change the minds of people like that, or will they just kind of move the goalposts and just shift their position a little bit and not actually acknowledge?
Well, it depends on which you're talking about. As far as mechanosynthesis is concerned, it eliminates the problem. Obviously, Smalley was not speaking accurately when he said that it was impossible because mechanosynthesis has now been experimentally demonstrated, so there's no longer any argument. If, however, you're talking about the succeeding stages in the process, it's now possible to say, well, yeah, you can do mechanosynthesis, but what about these later stages in the process? How do you build a fabricator? How do you build the nanofactory? How do you build the respirocytes and make that whole sequence work? But at this point, the shift from the core issues have not been demonstrated experimentally to mechanosynthesis has been demonstrated experimentally has now taken place. And we're now talking about how it is we move forward on that process.
So yes, how do we move forward? What is the next step? You mentioned that right now you're working on sort of a 3-dimensional build rather than 2-dimensional. Is that the next step?
Well, there are a variety of things going on. I think one of the things people have to understand is that this is a team effort. There are a lot of people working on it. They're very good. They've done absolutely fantastic work. I'm incredibly proud of the entire team. They are marvelous. And they are focused on moving forward with the technology. So having a group of people who are working on mastering mechanosynthesis, which is the next immediate goal, and having them moving in the right direction is the thing that happens. And there's no specific thing I can point to and say this or that or the other is a key objective. The whole collection of them. There are a whole set of things that are being worked on to move forward. The concept that we will be able to arrange atoms in pretty much the way we want is clearly being advanced, and the systematic effort to make that happen is what's important. The fact that we have a team, that team is working systematically to move the ball forward is, I think, the most important thing that we can say right now.
When I talk about cryonics and biostasis, of course, I always get the question, when will we be able to revive a patient? It's an annoying question because we really don't know the answer. So I'm going to be annoying in return and ask you, are you willing to make a forecast, maybe a range within which you think this might actually develop into something we could use for tissue repair, for instance?
Well, Kurzweil has been pretty accurate in forecasting things, and he uses a methodology which is to gather data, and then he plots the data on semi-log paper. And if he sees something that looks approximately like a straight line, then he says, that looks approximately like a straight line on semi-log paper. I will extrapolate the straight line. And if you ask, when will we achieve some particular capability, he says, well, according to this straight line on semi-log paper, that will happen on the following date. And he's been pretty good. That is a method of extrapolation that works and is quite good about getting timing. The critical question is, when do you run out? So you have to have a couple of answers. You have to say, how far can I push the technology until it hits a fundamental physical limit? And it turns out, well, in the case of Moore's law, people have been predicting its demise for years on end, and it keeps on plugging away. But we're getting pretty close to stuff that's going to be hard to move forward with at this point. So that's one method. Now, to do that, you need data. So that means we have to collect data on how many atoms we're moving and then plot the number as it moves forward. So right now, we don't have enough data to do that. So I'm hesitant to say exactly how long it's going to take. Once we do have enough data, we can start extrapolating the straight lines on semi-log paper and saying, well, according to the data we've collected, it looks like it will take thus and so long.
Okay, so not enough data points. We have like old data points, the famous image of the IBM being spilled out by xenon atoms. That's kind of an early data point, I suppose. And now we're just beginning to get some new ones. So, yeah, as you say, there's not really enough to better reasonably extrapolate a date. So,
on the other hand, I can say with a fairly high degree of confidence that things are going to move along a lot more rapidly than I think most people in the world think. This kind of technology is clearly coming, and it's coming at a pace which is going to be accelerating.
One question about that, which I'm sure a lot of people probably have in their mind. I actually saw, I know Eric Drex has been mostly writing about AI risk these days, but he did write something on his blog not too long ago, which had a fairly optimistic view that current AI, LLM AI, might actually accelerate progress in this area. What do you think about that? Because I'm somewhat skeptical about the current models of AI. I think they're going to have some limitations, but it does seem they're very good at dealing with combinations and finding the search space. Do you think it's going to be helpful in this kind of work?
Well, I've found that the LLMs right now are useful for looking at a paper and critiquing it. So if you walk up and you say, here's a paper, tell me what's wrong with it, it will find 10 of the top 5 errors. And okay, so it finds a few errors that aren't errors, but that's fine. If it finds 5 things that you need to correct, then that's a win. I don't see it right now, and that's in the process of changing, of course. But right now, I don't see it handing us the finished paper. And there are some people who have said, well, they did manage to get some scientific results out of the LLMs. I haven't seen it quite yet, but maybe that's because I haven't been dealing at the forefront of AI. I've been dealing with nanotechnology.
Mm-hmm. Of course, Drexler and Frieders, especially with his 2 big volumes and then his new Crystasis book, have a lot of theoretical designs for nanomachines. Do you think that AI can actually help with generating these kind of designs and improving them and suggesting things that may not occur to us otherwise?
Well, I'm not sure it will generate stuff that didn't occur to us otherwise, but there's a lot of work. Let's put it this way. If the replicating unit has about 100 million atoms in it, you have to design with complete detail where all those atoms are. So if you're going to design a replicating unit that's got 100 million atoms in it, it would be really helpful if you had some AI that understood how to do design work of molecular machines and could crank out the design for you. And that kind of capability looks like it's feasible. I haven't seen that demonstrated quite yet. The understanding of three-dimensional structure and what's going on in space seems to be, right now I've seen the LLMs doing textual manipulation very well. So they can do very good textual manipulation. They can analyze equations, do a lot of stuff. I haven't seen them do three-dimensional designs of atomically precise structure, presumably because that's not the highest priority for the folks who are designing the AIs.
I think they also have a trouble with spatial relationships.
Yeah.
Doing text is one thing, but spatial relationships, maybe that once we put them into robots and put them out into the world, they might develop more of a sense of how things work.
Yeah, I think basically the robotics is going to push the development of AI that has really good understanding of spatial relationships, and presumably is pushing it already. But then that expertise has to flow back into sort of things that are available to the rest of us, so we can go ahead and say, hey, design me a nanofactory, or design me a replicating unit, and it can then go ahead and do that. So that involves the integration of a number of capabilities, and I think that's going to happen. I just don't know exactly when that's going to happen, but that I would say is going to happen on the order of a year or two or three. Just sort of taking a rough look at how fast AI has been progressing.
Yeah, although that could speed things up, we also can run into unexpected roadblocks, of course. I think a classic example is if you go back to the late 1990s, we were decoding the human genome, and everybody was terribly excited that we're going to have lots of fantastic new drug targets and really make great advances. And what happened instead was the number of drug approvals went down for various reasons, including regulatory reasons. So
regulatory concerns are a concern. So I'm not sure that I can speak with confidence about regulatory delays. I can imagine a lot of regulatory delays involving reviving people who have been cryopreserved. And once we get to the point of actually doing it, interesting. People who have been running around saying it's impossible will then say, well, we have to regulate it.
Yeah.
So that we'll see how that works.
I read Eric's book way back in, 40 years ago now. Could you comment on that model of nanotechnology that Eric laid out back in Engines of Creation and his later books? Is that still basically valid, or are we taking different pathways these days?
The concept that you use positional control at the molecular scale is very much valid. That's exactly what scanning tunneling microscopes do. There are other routes to building various structures. I mean, you probably heard of the DNA origami work, where you take DNA and build things by self-assembly. That's a very interesting route. I don't know how to use that to revive someone who's been cryopreserved, mostly because in order to revive someone who's been cryopreserved, you need to have everything work at the temperature of at least liquid nitrogen and possibly lower, because that's what you need to do. There is damage in cryopreservation that must be repaired prior to warming. And repairing that damage will necessarily require medical nanorobots or cryobots that are able to function at cryogenic temperatures and carry out those repairs.
You think that at like minus 80 degrees C would be too warm? There'd be too much activity at that point?
Well, I mean, you can debate the exact temperature, but clearly you have to be close to the glass transition point, because if you warm up above that, things they start moving around. Certainly you want it below the point where it's liquid. So the temperature, I think I'll leave open. There's a lot of discussion about exactly what temperatures you want. If you've kept someone in liquid nitrogen for some fairly long period of time and they're stable in liquid nitrogen, you might want to consider carrying out the repairs at the temperature of liquid nitrogen, simply because you know that temperature is acceptable. But whatever the exact temperature, you don't want to warm things up. You don't want things liquid, because at that point everything falls apart. I mean, if you have membrane damage, if you have fractures and you warm things up, it doesn't work very well. So that's a problem.
So people come to wonder how these devices could operate at cryogenic temperatures. How would we do that?
It's actually fairly easy. If you are operating in a, how do I put it? If you're operating in a vacuum, then you have bearings and you have arms and you have robotic structures, all of which work just fine at low temperature. So if a bearing is designed out of atomically precise structures, it can rotate smoothly and easily regardless of the temperature. So it could even operate at the mythical temperature of 0 kelvins, which is difficult to get to, but the temperature of operation for an atomically precise bearing is not going to have an impact on whether or not it functions. So I mean, basically you can have something that would involve bearings in vacuum or screw joints, screw slides, a whole range of mechanical devices will work just fine.
Would the devices themselves generate heat that we would then have to carry away by some means?
Everything generates heat. I mean, one of the things that's the real heat generator is going to be the computation. Let me walk you through the standard scenario. The standard scenario is someone who is cryopreserved comes in at liquid nitrogen temperature. So the standard scenario is you have cryobots, and the cryobots go through the circulatory system and open it up. And they open it up in much the same way that miners would open up a tunnel. So they go through the circulatory system, remove that which is in the circulatory system, the cryopreserved plasma. They remove that. And then once that's removed, you now have access to the entire body. You're within 20 to 40 microns of everything in the body. So once you've done that, then you can go through and inspect at a high resolution the entire body, and you can determine where the fractures are. Now, you don't compute inside, so a cryobot does not have vast computational resources. What it does have is communications. So when you lay out, when you go through the circulatory system, you lay out the communications network so that the cryobots that are inspecting what's inside can pass the information back to a very large computer, which is outside. And the reason the very large computer is outside is the very large computer is going to generate heat. And if you are at liquid nitrogen temperature, you don't want to add too much heat to you, because then you'd warm up. So you communicate the information to the very big computer. The very big computer chews on the information, figures out what needs to happen, and then gives orders to the cryobots internally. And the first thing they do is repair fractures or other damage that would prevent rewarming. So once you've repaired the fractures, once you've repaired any other membrane damage or other damage that would prevent rewarming, then you can warm the tissue up to the temperature of water. So it would be, say, at 40 degrees centigrade, 40 Fahrenheit, sorry.
40 Fahrenheit, I think, yes. 40
yes,
centigrade
that would be the wrong temperature, yes. So you warm it up, you basically warm it up until the ice has just melted. And then at that temperature, you can introduce what you might call conventional medical nanorobots. And then they can carry out further repairs at that temperature. And then following that, you can then warm the person up to an operational temperature. And then they wake up and say, hey, I woke up. How interesting.
I like the phrase you use, conventional medical nanorobots. So, yeah, yes.
Yeah. That is, well, that's, I think, the conventional medical nanorobots are something that everyone is interested in. Cryobots at this point is an interest of a smaller number of people, but I think it will be developed by us, by the cryonics community, simply because we're going to be the ones that are most interested. Although you can make a fairly good argument that a general purpose medical nanorobot should be able to deal with frostbite. So,
And for those who want more detail, much more detail, they should read Robert Fader's book, Cryostasis Revival, who goes into a number of different scenarios in enormous detail, calculating how much energy, how much information, how you deal with the heat. That book actually you can get free in PDF form, or you can buy the hardcover book from Biostasis Technologies if you prefer to read it that way. And that really does go into tremendous detail.
Yeah, it's on the Alcor website.
Yeah. Now, one question that was suggested I ask you, I thought was an interesting question because, in sort of our community, the foresight community, the extropian community, and so on, we've been interested for much longer than other people in prediction markets and decision markets.
Oh, yeah.
Do you think prediction markets can play a role in advancing cryonics or prioritizing research objectives?
I have been fond of prediction markets for decades. And the problem is, let's put it this way. If you want to control the dialogue, if you want to control how people are communicating, so you want to control the message, prediction markets are terrible, because prediction markets come up with statements that might not be consistent with what you want to tell people. And as a consequence, anyone who is interested in controlling the conversation, which is pretty much everybody, will hate prediction markets, because the prediction market means they lose control. The prediction market can say stuff that might be inconsistent with the statements they want to have happen, in which case you got a problem. So I like prediction markets. What I've been seeing is that it takes a while for them to be accepted in a social sense, and they tend to be cropping up in relatively narrow areas. They aren't seeing the widespread applicability that I would like to see them used for. They are being used in some areas. They're used a lot in politics to see who's going to win the next election. They're used in horse race betting. They're used in stuff like that. But there's a lot of areas where I would like to see them used where there are social forces at work that make them less able to be adopted.
And of course, they work better when you have many people betting rather than a small number. If you just have like 50 people, and you're not necessarily guaranteeing the market's not necessarily going to be accurate. If we had 1 million people, then it's probably more likely to converge on something more accurate.
I don't know. I think they are pretty good. What happens is the people who know what's going on get attracted to the market the moment they hear about it and start placing bets because they figure, I can make some money on this. But widespread availability would be obviously a good thing.
I don't know how many people you really need. I know one of the early uses that was kind of a very practical use was by Hewlett-Packard. They had to try and forecast the number of cartridges they were going to sell, and they used prediction markets early on to do that. And
that was much better.
Pretty good results, yeah. So, but there you've got people actually who are quite expert in that. So, probably enough of them to make the market work well.
Well, you need someone to get social adoption of a prediction market. You need someone who actually wants the results of the prediction, rather than someone who has an agenda that they are trying to persuade people of. The moment you have people with agendas, then hey, prediction markets are a problem. If someone actually wants to know what's going to happen, and there are such people floating around, then they will support the prediction market because they want the results.
It would be nice if, in politics and economics, we could get people used to using prediction markets. So instead of just listening to politicians' opinions, there might be like a default view. This is the winning prediction of what's
What?
likely to happen if you implement tariffs or cut taxes or whatever.
Use
Uh,
prediction markets to avoid catastrophes like Brexit?
yeah.
Or use a
Well,
prediction market on whether or not we should go to war with Iran?
yeah. Or, whether implementing tariffs is a good or bad idea, or whether raising taxes or not
A
tackling
variety of
security
things.
problems. All these things.
Well, there are people who currently don't want to have prediction markets because they want to decide the agenda. They want to decide what's going on. They want to control the conversation. So, that's an issue.
Yeah. One topic I'd like to touch on a little bit, and if you remember back in, I think it was the Extra One conference. I think you talked on cryonics and cryptography,
Yes.
and I think last year at Vitalist Bay you also kind of reminded
Yes.
people of that. But many people probably are not familiar with this idea, and I've stolen your example, by the way, Ralph, quite a
Oh,
few times.
go for it.
I'm talking about brain repair. I talk about the idea of, and it's probably not exactly the way you put it, but I talk about someone who's planning something nefarious, like robbing a bank or whatever, and writes down their plans on a piece of paper, and then they think, oh my goodness, that was a bad idea, and they shred the paper in a couple of different directions and throw it in the trash, and they think they've destroyed the information. But if the NSA or the CIA is watching, they might fish out those pieces of paper, lay them out, scan them, and run an algorithm on them which would reconstruct that information. And actually, recently, Carrie did a really nice piece about about Vesuvius, where these artifacts have been covered in lava, and there are objects which had writing on them, and
Oh,
for
yeah.
centuries we've been completely unable to read that. So it looks like the information was destroyed, but now we have new technologies that can actually read that information, so it wasn't destroyed. So can you explain a little bit about how cryptographic techniques could be used, perhaps, to help revive cryonics patients?
So, the basic idea, everyone thinks everything has to be preserved perfectly for cryonics to work. Well, maybe not everyone, but a lot of people think that you have to preserve everything. And they say, well, if you're following a nerve along its path, if there's damage somewhere along the path, oh, well, then we can't follow the path of the nerve, and then cryonics won't work because you don't know how to revive the person because obviously can't tell where the nerve went if it's damaged in the middle. That's simply not true. And in particular, if you look at the cryptanalysis of World War II rotor machines, World War II rotor machines worked by having disks, and the wiring in the disks was randomized. The disks would let you permute the 26 letters of the alphabet, and that permutation was encoded in wiring. And what's interesting about the cryptanalysis of the World War II rotor machines is you could deduce the wiring in the complete absence of any knowledge of where the wires went. And I actually walked through this. I mean, you read the paper, I'm sure. And I actually walked through this analysis where you start out with not knowing where the wires are connected and then gradually utilize information about the encrypted message to allow you to deduce the wiring completely from first principles, just using a bunch of enciphered text. And you can use the same kind of thing in the human brain. The reason this works is that enciphered messages are redundant. In other words, they have patterns in them. And if you decipher with the wrong set of wiring, then you're going to find that you don't get that redundancy out. So when you try to decipher a message, if you decipher it with the wrong cryptographic key, it doesn't work. And in the cryptanalytic techniques I'm referring to, you convert the discrete problem into a continuous problem. In other words, instead of having zeros and ones, and the 0 is a 0 and the 1 is a 1, which is binary, you have numbers that include 0 and 1 and everything in between. And if you do that, you can now have an analysis that lets you look at a continuous space and move in the continuous space in that direction which tends to produce a better decrypted message, where better means it has the redundancy expressed in the original message more apparently present. And you can do that once you take a discrete problem and convert it into a continuous problem. Then you can then look at different directions in the continuous space and find that direction which tends to improve the output. And you can apply that to cryptanalysis of the human brain. Look at it this way. What you can do is you can walk through the brain, and every time you see some confusion, you can say, well, there are multiple interpretations of this locally confused spot. And I will say that there are, a dozen interpretations or 5 interpretations, however many there are. And then I will walk through the entire brain with all of these multiple interpretations. And then I will say, those interpretations, we will start by assigning an initial probability to them based on the locally available evidence. And then we will look at how well the circuitry works. In other words, if I'm looking at you, and when I look at you, something goes through my optic nerve, it goes into some areas in the brain, it eventually winds up in the back of the brain, and it interprets what's going on. Now, if I look at you, and what I get at the back of the brain in a simulation of my brain is complete nonsense, and I say, well, I must have the wrong weights on these various errors. And you can pick that direction in the high dimensional space, which produces something that makes more sense at the back of my brain, and you simply keep doing that. So just as in the World War II rotor machine, you can deduce the wiring even when the wiring is absent, so too in reviving a cryopreserved patient, you can deduce what the wiring should be, what the neurons connect to, even if there is extensive damage. And we even have the neurons there. They might be damaged and there might be some local uncertainty about what the connections are, but you've got a lot of information about what the connections should be. And using standard cryptanalytic algorithms, you can use that information to figure out what a proper set of connections should be. And I'm pretty confident that I lost most of the audience on that one. But suffice to say, the guy, when I was back at Stanford, the guy in the next office was working on cryptanalysis of World War II rotor machines. So I had, a lot of discussions with him. And one day I woke up and said, hey, you can do the same thing with the neurons in the brain when you're reviving someone from cryopreservation.
This actually comes up in the biostasis community, because right now there's something of a bifurcation between those who prefer a cryopreservation approach and the people who prefer a chemical preservation approach. And of course, Ken Hayward with the Brain Preservation Prize insists on tracing connections through the brain, and if you can't do that, then he says it's no good. But you're really saying that's not really a good test.
That's a terrible test.
Yeah.
You've got massive redundancy in the human brain, and you can take advantage of that massive redundancy to figure out what should be there, even if you've got extensive damage. So, and frankly, the quality of cryopreservation we're seeing in today's cryopreservations is more than enough to provide the kind of information that's needed to revive a cryopreserved patient.
All right, and with the recent paper by Greg Fay and colleagues on Steve Cole's brain, which we talked about last month, actually some very good preservation, even though it was far from ideal conditions.
Yes.
So there's plenty left.
And you have to understand, we're looking at these brains using existing technology. So in the future, we'll literally be able to go through and pull out every molecule and exactly where it is. So that would be a huge amount of information that could all be used to deduce what's going on.
Now, I expect you're familiar with a paper by Mike Perry and Michael Mayer on using deep learning to reconstruct the structure of the brain from what's left. How does that relate to or differ from what we've just been talking about? I think it sounds like a bit of a different approach, but maybe complementary.
Well, I'm not sure. I'd have to go look at the paper in more detail to have an opinion offhand as to how it might differ. But certainly anything which is trying to figure out what the wiring should be given the redundancy in the human brain would be taking advantage of that redundancy in some fashion to figure out what it is that should be there.
Now, related to all of these ideas is another idea which you're very closely associated with, which is the idea of information theoretic death.
Mm-hmm.
Because people have a hard time with things like biostasis because they think, well, this person's not alive, so if they're not alive, they must be dead. It's kind of a false binary, really. Whereas there's this third state in between where you're certainly not alive because you're not metabolizing and not active, but you're not dead because the information remains. So it very much relates to what we've been talking about, because if you're in this other state where you're neither alive but not destroyed, then if you can reconstruct the information that was there, that was necessary for the brain to function, then in an important sense, you're not gone. The personal identity information remains. So I think these ideas all tie up together, and if people understand them, I think it will overcome some of these obstacles to people's thinking, this very binary thinking.
That would be nice. Okay, so as far as the information theoretic death is concerned, then you really have to understand what it is to be alive and what it is to be dead. And a lot of people look at living systems and say, the living system is a complicated molecular machine. And if that complicated molecular machine stops working, it's dead. And that perspective, if you adopt that perspective, then pretty clearly, if you cryopreserve someone, the complicated molecular machine is not working. But if you ask the question, can you restore that molecular machine to a functional state, given the cryopreserved state, that's a different question. Yeah. And the moment you ask that question, you start asking questions like, can I recognize what's there? Can I identify where the neurons go? Can I figure out what the neuronal connections should have been? And when you start asking that question, you're right in the middle of cryptography, cryptanalysis, information theoretic death, all of that stuff. And even people who are saying, well, if you're dead, if you're cryopreserved, you're dead because the machinery doesn't work. The moment you say, well, does that mean cryonics doesn't work? The typical response is, well, I'm not saying that. Maybe it works, but they're dead. And you go, wait a minute. Death is a permanent cessation of vital functions. If you can revive them, they're not dead. Right. At which point they start making perplexed noises about, well, you're definitely dead because I say you're dead. And then the response is, well, but if you can revive them, they're not dead. And they say, well, that's different. That's something else. I mean, they're dead because we define them to be dead. And then they get lost in a welter of confusion. The moment you say, if you can revive them with whatever technology might be available in the future, then you're asking a different set of questions. And I've been amazed at how many people just reject this. They say, well, okay, even if you could be revived, you're still dead. And furthermore, I have the right to block your cryopreservation, which is puzzling.
Why would they block it if you're dead? Because if you're dead, then you can't succeed in reviving.
Because it's wrong. No, seriously, I've encountered a number of people who get very upset at the idea of cryonics, and when I point out to them, either they can prove that cryonics doesn't work, or they can't, and if they can't prove it doesn't work, then they have to agree that there's some reasonable chance it doesn't. So there's some reasonable chance that cryonics will successfully revive people as long as they're cryopreserved. So then they start getting more confused, and they say, well, if you block a cryopreservation and cryonics works, then you've killed a person. I had a wonderful debate with some doctor on the internet many years ago, and he was very upset when I explained to them that if cryonics works and you block a cryopreservation, then you have killed someone. Yeah. And he couldn't cope with it. He just couldn't understand that logic. And I said, well, I would prefer not to be killed. And he thought, well, but you're dead. And he said, well, but if we can revive me in the future, I'm not dead. And he said, yes, you are. Well, what's your definition of death? Is your definition permanent, or is it a temporary condition? If it's a temporary condition, then you can define death as a temporary condition, but I will adopt a different definition, which is permanent death. And if I can be revived, I'm not dead. He had a hard time coping.
I wonder if these same people, if you took them back to before 1960, before we had CPR and defibrillation, would they say, no, you mustn't use those methods because you're dead, and
Probably.
if you start reviving people, it's going to upset my conceptual scheme.
Well, there's a whole legal case involving, hey, there's no checkbox for someone who's been cryopreserved. And the first thing that happened in that case is they conceded that there was, I believe they used the word ponderable. There's a ponderable chance that cryonics would work. And having conceded there was a ponderable chance it would work, I then became very puzzled as to why they continued to persistently say that the person was dead. Because they just conceded that it might work, in which case, if you block it, you've killed them if it worked. So, anyway. But you know, I have to say, though, that this concept that people decide on whether or not to sign up for cryonics because of rational reasons is, how shall I phrase it, not supported by any evidence that I've seen. And if you look at it, what you find is that there are a couple of things that are really going on. First off, you got to enjoy life. I mean, I had a friend of mine, I was trying to explain cryonics to him. And at some point he backed away with horror and said, look, life is bad enough as it is. The only thing that gets me through the day is the thought that, it's going to come to an end at some point. You want it to go on forever? And he was horrified. I mean, he was viscerally horrified. I mean, he had bouts with depression on and off. But it was a terrifying thought for him. So there are a lot of people who, living is okay, they'll put up with it, but it's not as though they actually want it. So those people, forget it. They're not going to sign up with cryonics. They just aren't.
It's kind of a passive suicide, really.
It is. But, there are a lot of people who are, kind of depressed about their life, and they're not thrilled. Then there is long-term planning. So a lot of people don't do long-term planning. They sort of deal with problems as they arise. Now, if you look at death as a problem and you say, well, I'll deal with that problem when it happens. Oops, too late. Cryonics doesn't work that way. You have to plan in advance. You have to think about it and say, oh, that's a problem. I should deal with that problem. If you don't plan in advance, it's not going to happen. And a lot of people have a hard time setting up insurance or a will or pretty basic stuff, and they don't do it. So that's another bunch of people who are not gonna be involved. Then you've got to think that medical technology is going to get a lot better. And it's perfectly obvious cryonics using existing technology won't revive you in a healthy state. It just won't. If you're cryopreserved today, today's technology cannot revive you. So if you think that future technology is going to be similar to today, but maybe a little bit improved, you're not going to sign up for cryonics because today's technology can't revive you, and you don't think future technology is going to be any better. And a lot of people have a hard time understanding the concept that technology can improve. They just, at some fundamental level, they don't understand that, and they don't get it. And then there are a whole lot of philosophical blockers. I mean, these are the things that we've run across fairly frequently. Things like death gives meaning to life. Oh, you've heard that statement before.
Yes, a few times.
So that's one of the obvious ones. And then there's death is inevitable. And if you take the philosophical stance that there's no way of getting around death, so you might as well not worry about it, then hey, you're not going to worry about it. And if you have the idea that, well, I'm going to go to heaven, by the way, that's an unacceptable theological position. You're supposed to stay on this earth. It's very clear. All religions have something in them that says, hey, don't commit suicide.
Right. Yeah.
But a lot of people say, hey, I want to go to heaven and meet my parents and stuff like that. So that's another philosophical
Mm.
blocker. Another one that I hear an awful lot is the future will be horrible.
Yeah,
Never
so I was going
quite
to bring that one up. Yeah.
figured that one out, but a lot of people
Mm.
say, oh, the future is going to be horrible, horrible. Aliens will come down and torture us. I go, what?
Or AIs, yeah.
What? Or the AIs.
Yeah.
Something is going to torture us. And I've
Mm.
never been able to quite figure out why people are so excited by this possibility. But, essentially what this boils down to is for the longest time, if you believe something that would kill you after you were 90, who cares? But today, if you believe something that will kill you after you're 90, it's lethal. So any belief, how do I put it? You know how in genetics, genes that help you when you're young but kill you when you're old
Right.
can be selected for
Mm-hmm.
and result in shorter lifespans? Same thing in memetics. If you have ideas or concepts or memes running around that kill you off, but don't kill you off until, you know, later, then yeah, they're not going to be, there's not a lot of selective pressure against them. And if
Yeah.
they have any advantages when you're younger, they'll be adopted. So, so it's emotions. People are mostly driven by emotions, and getting people to sort of absorb the idea of cryonics on an emotional level is very difficult. Logic doesn't seem to faze people. There are some people who are interested in logic, but I think the great majority, nah, that's not how you get to them.
Yeah, that's why I've argued. I did a piece on how to be persuasive when talking about life extension and cryonics, and I cite Aristotle, who explained that there are three approaches. There's logos, which is reason. There's ethos, which is your personal credibility, and then there's pathos, which is emotion. And you really,
Go for
people like
emotion.
us tend to rely on logic, but that doesn't work for most people. Reason and logic.
Exactly.
You have to use these other approaches as well. They can be complementary.
Well, I took a long time understanding this. What? You mean people aren't rational?
Yeah.
No, they are not rational.
Well, to be a little bit smug here, you and I have been right an awful lot, Ralph, over the years and decades. We've been right about this stuff, and we get increasingly validated as being right.
Yes,
Um,
that's correct. You're quite
yeah,
right.
I
Yes,
think so.
yes, yes, yes.
So the question is there a topic in cryonics where you've really strongly changed your mind, or uh, you pretty
I
much
guess I used to think that logic and rationality were
okay?
more valuable than I do now. So I've gradually learned that lesson. But as for the rest of it, nah. I mean, I decided, I guess it was somewhere in the 80s, that I completed, I was married, we had a house, I had a career, my wife had a career, everything was going fine. And I did long-term planning. You'll notice that's one of the things that you have to have if you're going to sign up for cryonics is long-term planning. So I did long-term planning, and my long-term planning reached the conclusion that, hey, the next big event in my life is I die. And I thought about that for a while and said, in this modern era of 1988, or I think it was 88, somewhere in that ballpark, in this modern era of 1988, surely something can be done about this. So I just started systematically thinking about it. And I was at Xerox PARC at the time, so I had access to their excellent library facilities. It's not that they had a big library at PARC, it's that they could get anything you wanted.
Mm,
Interlibrary loan, tracking it down, bringing it anywhere. They would find stuff. So I used that library extensively to find articles on postmortem changes to the human brain and that area of research. And I tracked down all kinds of articles. I'm
mm,
sure they loved it. They love tracking down obscure references. So I tracked them down and I read through them. I had a stack of articles a foot high, walking through all of the things that happen when you are, you're legally dead and your brain is undergoing changes. And I just reviewed it systematically. and I was reviewing it from the perspective of, is information theoretic death going to occur? And the conclusion I reached was, no. You've got at least hours, maybe a day, maybe more than a day, before you have changes that are sufficiently extensive that you will not be able to recover the personality relevant information that defines who you are. And that conclusion is, stood the test of time as far as I can tell. And, the ultimate test is we start reviving people.
Right. Well, and the intermediate test, of course, that we're already reviving tissues, and now we seem to be on the edge of reliably, reversibly cryopreserving mammalian organs. So it becomes harder for people to say that's impossible when we're talking about a brain as an organ. If we can do this with mammalian organs, suddenly, it's really putting the pressure on them to say, why shouldn't we be able to extend it to the brain?
You're talking logic again.
Oh, I'm sorry. I tend to do that. It's really annoying.
Yes, I know. Some of us have that weakness. We think logic and rationality and evidence are somehow important in making decisions. And also we think, life is a good thing. And there are people who think they're not interested in living. I think Shirley MacLaine was the person who said, all of my friends who have died say it's the greatest experience. And I'm going, that's interesting. Yes, I can understand where she might not wish to be cryopreserved if her friends have told her that dying is something that's a wonderful experience.
Yeah, I tend not to rely on voices in my head. Actually, I don't really have voices in my head. So I guess she does. So she thinks that other people are interesting.
I'm not sure. Maybe. Who knows?
Yeah. Well, I think we've covered all the main things. There were a couple of other bonus questions, perhaps, if you have any comments on this. Blockchain technology has become quite a thing in recent years. So one of the questions that was suggested is, what is your view of the usefulness or not of blockchain technologies? Do you think they're a really big innovation that is important, or is it sort of a distraction?
I think it is important. I think what it does fundamentally is give you a mechanism for reliable, distributed, coordinated activities. And this reliably distributed, nonstop capability is very useful for certain kinds of things. Now, clearly there's a substantial overhead in setting up the blockchain. So in a lot of cases, it's just not worth the candle. But if what you need is something that is transparent, so everybody knows what it is, and it's reliable, and it's distributive, so everybody, wherever they are, can see what's going on, and you want it to continue pretty much regardless, then the whole blockchain technology is great. And there are problems like that in the world. And I think problems like that, I've been particularly fond of it in terms of how it might assist governance. Because one of the issues you have is, hey, gee, governments tend to be corrupt and they tend to be, they have various failings. Surely we can use this technology, which is reliable and unstoppable and transparent and has these other good things going for it. Surely we can use this technology to good advantage to deal with some of the issues involved in governance. I think the answer is yes. On the other hand, the problem then becomes, how do you introduce a reliable technology which is transparent and all that if you've got crooks running the government?
Yeah, they don't want it.
They don't want it. Yeah, exactly. So how do you get that sort of introduced in a way that sort of creeps in over time? I think it will creep in because I think it has advantages for certain applications that are just too strong to ignore. I mean, obviously Bitcoin is still running, and it's running after, decades of time. It's running after lots of people have tried to shut it down. Everyone has been upset about it, but it keeps running.
Yeah.
So
that's another thing we were right about, right? Back in Extra magazine in the 90s, we talked about these digital technologies, digital currencies, and so on. We were saying this is complete nonsense, and now you can't really argue that anymore. I think one way these blockchain technologies may be adopted is because there's a decrease in trust in authority figures. And so if you have decrease in trust in authority figures, you need to have a different approach to trust. And this actually enables that and as you say, it's transparent and distributed. So I think that might actually help because this breakdown in trust,
it has some advantages.
Motivation for it.
Now so far, I haven't seen, I mean, how do I put it? The dollar as a currency has advantages over Bitcoin. I think the big advantage is Bitcoin tends to fluctuate in value. So you want something that is perhaps a bit more stable, although, there are other approaches that are trying to deal with that. I think one of the things going on, though, is that people are exploring all of these ideas. Some of them proven to be, problematic. The other thing that's going on, which is a big problem, is that oftentimes someone will set up shop and say, give me your money, and I will then go ahead and put it in Bitcoin. Please trust me. And people don't realize that they're not dealing with Bitcoin if they're giving their money to someone who is acting as an exchange. And that creates a whole set of issues that are problematic. And then when the person absconds with their money, they say, oh, Bitcoin took my money. No, it wasn't Bitcoin. It was the person they trusted to take their money and put it into Bitcoin that took their money.
Well, I think we've covered everything here, but I'm hoping that progress will be rapid in the next few years, and we can have you back before too long to talk about the great advances that are going on.
Well, the advances are going to continue. I don't know exactly how fast they are going to continue, but I do know that, we're going to be reviving people from cryopreservation at some point. That looks like it's in the cards for a variety of technical, logical, and rational reasons. And
if only we could coming back.
Yep.
Yeah, I look forward to the future because I think the future tends to be better than the present. It generally has improved over time. People don't get that because they have false views of the past. So,
well, they have newspapers that they read. If it bleeds, it leads.
Yeah, exactly.
So,
focusing on the bad stuff.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Ralph.
Well,
Thanks
thank you
for being on. And we'll follow up next time there's a big advance.
Sounds good. Take care.